The co-chairs of the Women's Faculty Network, and we're really happy to see you here on behalf of the other two chairs, Dr. Shirley Mills, who couldn't be with us today, and Dr. Wang, who also, I don't know if she's coming or couldn't be with us today, but we want to welcome you. We see a lot of new faces, and we're glad that you're here. We hope it's not the first time, but that you continue to attend our workshops. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Cecilia Conrad with us. She is the Vice President of the MacArthur Fellows Program. She has served as Vice President for Academic Affairs and Acting President of Pomona College in California. She is an economist by training. She has a long history of working on gender and racial, ethnic-related issues in academia. Dr. Conrad has also been actively engaged in faculty development, particularly for faculty of color and women, and in promoting education, especially in the undergraduate education. This has been throughout her career, and if you want a little bit more information on Dr. Conrad's works, you can reach it at ceciliaconrad.macfound.org. So without further ado, Dr. Conrad.
Thank you very much for inviting me and having me here. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and I have to tell you that McAllen was figured importantly in my growing up, because during the summer in Dallas, where it can get very hot, I used to play a trick on myself. I would watch the news report and see the temperature in McAllen and say, it's not so bad. So I've always been curious about McAllen. And then I've also heard quite a bit about some of the exciting work that's happening here at UT Pan American. You have some numbers to really be proud of. #1 in producing mathematics, Hispanic mathematics, bachelor's degrees in the country. I also was entertained by some of the work that the prizes won by the engineering students, including the concrete canoe, which I didn't know about, and maybe somebody can explain it to me later about why one would have a concrete canoe. But what I'm here today to talk a bit about is the experiences I've had with thinking about mentoring, and I'm going to do it in a slightly indirect way. It's going to be partly a personal narrative intermingled with some data and a few pieces of information along the way. I welcome questions throughout. So please stop and comment or ask questions if you want. I want to begin with a personal story. When one of my second, actually, position as an assistant professor, I was an assistant professor at Barnard College in New York, which is the college for women that's part of Columbia University. And after the third year there, I was given a research leave. It was a very generous program they had to try and help assistant professors who were spending a lot of time teaching get ready for the tenure review process. But during my research leave, I was asked to serve on the college's reaccreditation committee. All right, it was called Committee C because it followed Committee A and B, and our job was to put together all of the work done by the other committees and to construct the report to the reaccreditation agency. We can talk later about the advisability of a pre-tenured faculty member taking their research leave and serving on a reaccreditation committee. We'll come back to that. But one of the committee conversations, one of the meetings was focused on faculty diversity. And the dean of my college had prepared a short paper. And the title of the paper is, "Why Should We Care About Faculty Diversity?" And his argument was that maybe the college should not endeavor to have a diverse faculty. And he identified 3 reasons. He said, well, there's 3 reasons why people want faculty diversity. The first is this idea that by having a diverse faculty, we'll be able to bring more into the curriculum about the experiences of women or of minority groups and so on. He says, but most of the research being done is not being done by the women and the minorities. And so we could hire somebody else to teach those classes. We don't have to diversify the faculty to diversify the curriculum. That was his first point. His second point was, he says, well, the other argument is people talk about role models and mentors. He says, but how far are you going to carry this? Does it mean that we have to have a Korean woman for Korean student mentors and a black woman for the black students and this and that and so on? And I really don't think that you have to be the member of the same group in order to be an effective and good mentor for the individual. And then his third argument was that minority faculty in particular are really expensive. They are getting paid these extravagant salaries by places like Harvard and Duke. And at the time, this was right after Henry Louis Gates had moved from place to place and gotten offered some incredibly high salaries. And so he cited that as an example. So his argument was that maybe a small college like Barnard with not a lot of resources really shouldn't put much effort into diversifying the faculty. Now, he finished his paper, and seated around the room were all the members of the committee, and of course, there was me. At the time, the only woman of color on the faculty. Going back to that, why was I on this committee? And so, of course, all the eyes turned and looked at me when he finished his speech. Now, mind you, this is the dean who's just read this paper. And so everybody turned and looked at me. And in what I will describe as an exquisite display of the thin line between mau-mauing and tomming, I looked at him and I smiled and I said, I only have one question. He said, what's that? I said, who's paying these high salaries and where do I sign up? Now, my dean actually was, I don't think he sincerely subscribed to the arguments that he was putting forward. He was raising some challenges, and they're challenges that kind of have echoed as I have thought through the rest of my career. Challenges about understanding why I am where I am, understanding the balancing of what I'm going to talk about as risk, reward, and responsibility. That is part of the academic life for a woman, for faculty of color, and particularly for a woman of color in academia. And how understanding those combinations, I think, is a critical part of being able to be a mentor for not only someone more junior than myself, but also a peer mentor for the friends like me who are going through these same circumstances. I have frequently asked myself whether being on that committee was dumb and a mistake I committed because I didn't have a mentor at the time who told me, no, don't do it, or incredibly strategic. Because it did turn out to be a valuable network that I formed from working on that committee. Valuable insights into some of my dean's thoughts. Valuable insights into others. And so that's another issue that I want for us to talk a little bit about is that kind of, as I said, the risk-reward responsibility balance that we're doing. So I want to start with the notion of risk. And part of one of my earlier things in my career was that I was the director of a program in economics, which Marie's going to take over soon. Well, you just took over. It is a mentoring program. At the time that I ran it, it was called the Pipeline Project. And it was designed to try and increase the numbers of African Americans, Latinos, and American Indians with PhDs in economics. And we had a mentoring program where we tried to match up graduate students with senior mentors in their field. We couldn't do it, as my dean had said, we couldn't do it completely matched on every different characteristic because there simply weren't enough senior people in the field to do that. But we tried to find people who we thought would be good advisors to those individual students. And the program had some really valuable impacts, I think, on the individual participants, but they weren't necessarily what we started out thinking. So let me start with the mentoring aspect of it. We assigned to each person a senior faculty member at a college or institution, maybe not their own, some were nearby, some were further away, and we were relying on e-communication. But every summer, we brought everyone together for a summer conference. And the summer conference happened at the same place as a program that the Economics Association ran for undergraduate students who thought they might want to do PhDs in economics. So what we had gathered in this one place were undergraduates, graduate students, senior faculty. And it turned out that one of the more valuable parts of the program was not the mentoring relationship with the senior faculty, which turned out to be kind of hit or miss. Like you assigned people and some people clicked and they built relationships, and you assigned other people and they never really clicked and they didn't really make a lot of effort or talk to each other. But what emerged was both a peer mentoring network among the graduate students, many of whom were isolated at individual institutions, and a network between the undergraduates and the graduate students, where the graduate students assumed some responsibility for mentoring the undergraduate students, and they expected to assume that responsibility because they were in turn being mentored in the program. That was the good thing about it. One of the things that was a cause of concern for me in the program, though, was that there is a way in which we funnel people into graduate programs, and this is certainly true in economics, and I suspect it's true in other disciplines. We champion the need for diversity because we want people to bring different perspectives, to ask different questions, to think about the world in different ways. We think that it's that kind of diversity that leads to greater creativity. And I'm happy to talk about creativity in my current job later. But the funneling process through graduate school is one that tends to homogenize. And so that the people who came out on the other side, the people who survived that process, frequently in my mind didn't look any different in terms of their work or their thought process than the people who were already in the field. And so one of the things that I've tried to keep in mind is that there is this need to help people navigate what can be risky terrain, that is, trying to maintain some particularly independent way or distinctive way of asking questions and looking at things, trying to help them manage that risk without obliterating the diversity we were trying to bring to the field altogether. The other part of that is to help individuals stay focused on what they think is important, what it is that brought them into this discipline, what are the important questions. Because I think the downside of the homogenization process is that there comes a point where the passion's gone. And if the passion's gone, then it's very hard to stay productive. The worst case scenario is the passion goes away in graduate school and they never get the PhD and they'll never be here in this room. Sometimes the passion disappears while you're an assistant professor, but usually that kind of carrot out there of tenure is enough to keep you going. But what we sometimes will see is that right after tenure, the passion's gone because you've lost the sense of why you came and how you were going to shake the world up, and then people tend to stall at the associate professor level. So this notion of that some of this involves taking risk is critically important. Some of the risk, of course, involves just getting the research out. I have, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you the sort of traditional notion of academia as the three-ring circus. And the three-ring circus being that we have to worry about tenure, we have to worry, in order to get tenure, we have to worry about research, we have to worry about teaching, and we have to worry about service. And how do you balance and how do you juggle those things? But the first one I want to talk a bit about is research, because we're in a room of friends, and I want to show you some data that is a little disturbing. And it's data that compares research productivity. The first picture here is looking at pre-tenured, tenure-track faculty who are at the end of their first 5 years. So this is typically about the time you're about to be reviewed for tenure. And this, what I am showing you are the average number of publications at the middle of the distribution of faculty. And I've done it here by gender. Men are blue, women are red. And I've done it broken out by race. And what stands out when you look at it, first of all, you have Asian Pacific Islander men who are kind of off the chart there. But then you have Asian Pacific Islander women, much, much lower on the average. Black African American, again, a gender difference, lower numbers overall. Hispanic, white, Hispanic, black, again, a gender difference. And white, non-Hispanic, yes.
I know this is a question that I could probably nitpick for days and weeks, but how are we measuring productivity? Simply numbers?
Yes, these are self-reported because this is coming from the National Survey of Post-Secondary Faculty. So it's self-reported publication kind of counts. Okay, yeah, just numbers, just numbers. But there are several other kinds of metrics I look at, and they all tend to support that there is a research productivity differential. I'm going to modify that in just a moment a little bit. What's interesting about this, though, is that if you look at the same survey of self-reports, there isn't a differential in time spent on research. But there is a differential in time spent on everything else. So it's sort of a puzzling empirical thing to me, right? Because it either means that women, for example, report spending more time on teaching than men. Women and faculty of color report spending more time on service, and I'm going to show you some of those numbers, than do white men. Women report spending more time on what's called unpaid faculty work, which seems to mean advising and so on. So all of those things, but if you add all those up, then if they're spending the same time on research, it makes you wonder about the quality of that time, given everything else they're doing. Or you wonder if there's some reporting issue going on. But it was hard to find that it was a time differential in terms of time spent on research. I've been trying to explore why this differential exists. But let me show you one other piece of information here. And this is going to be for men, and I'm going to show you in a minute for women. And it's something that, at least for me, was newsworthy. Because for myself, I know that I spend a lot of time beating myself up about my lack of productivity. And I tend to compare myself to the Henry Louis Gates who are getting paid the high salaries that we talked about earlier, not realizing that there's actually a real skew to who's producing what in academia. And for me, this actually was somewhat comforting to look at this and to realize that most of what I was looking at before was being driven by a few people. This is for men, and what I've done is broken people up by average number of publications, broken up by percentiles in terms of numbers of publications. And what you can see is that there's this top 90th percentile who's producing a lot, according to this metric, for what it's worth. And then everybody else, you have a range here, but there's a real drop between the 90th and the 75th. And the same is true for women, so that if you get away from the 90th percentile, you'll see is much lower for women. But the 90th percentile and the 75th percentile for women, it's not as dramatic as my first graph suggested. Because women are just less likely to be in that real upper tail of the distribution. Now, as I said, for me this was comforting because it made me change my target a little. It made me realize that, yeah, Henry Louis Gates, who's not even in my discipline, I don't know why I'm picking him. Let's pick, what's the guy who was going to be the Fed chair and he didn't get it? Yeah, let's pick Larry Summers, okay? Instead of comparing myself to Larry Summers, who actually doesn't teach at all, and doesn't have, and he has other responsibilities now, but he gets paid a lot for them, that I really should be thinking more about where people are in the 75th and the 90th percentile, I mean the 75th percentile in that earlier diagram when I make my comparisons. But asking why this is has been intriguing because it doesn't seem to be time. Although I think it doesn't seem to be time and measured in just time units. I think quality of time is an issue. Whether it takes the form of having time that's segmented and broken up into 15 or 30-minute segments as opposed to having hour or 3 hours, 3 block of 3 hours, or whether it's just how mentally focused you are when you are engaged in lots of other activities, as I'm about to show you. The last part of taking risks that I'll mention is the interdisciplinary work and what one might call heretical work, which also can make it difficult because it can change the availability of publishing outlets. And that's a risk that needs to be contended with and appraised and thought about in making the decision process. Responsibility. I talk about assuming responsibility, but then I'll add to that, but not all the responsibility. And let me open this with just a little bit of tale of recognition about what my responsibilities were. Right after I got tenure at Barnard, and I did actually get tenure at Barnard and at Columbia, I was sitting in a seminar at Columbia. And it was a seminar that was being given by a woman economist, and it was really quite interesting. But I had noticed a pattern in the seminar over time, is that whenever a woman came to give the seminar, there was always a lot of backroom chatter. Like a kind of back of the table would be chattering with each other. And sometimes it would be kind of little sarcastic asides about the presentation, about what the person was saying. That was really just quite obnoxious and got on my nerves quite a bit. So I'm sitting in the seminar, and I'd gotten there late, so I'm stuck at the backroom table with the people doing all the little chattering. And I'm sitting with one of my students whom I had brought to the seminar, who was thinking about getting a PhD in economics. And while they were chattering, I wrote a note to her, and I said, these guys really get on my nerves. They do this all the time when there are women presenters. And my student wrote, tell them to shut up, you have tenure. And it was this moment of recognition of a certain responsibility that came with having the tenured role on the faculty. And indeed, I did tell them to hush, and they shut up. So it's important to take responsibility. But what I'll show you next are some of the numbers that has to do with the other things that women faculty are spending their time on. And this has to do with service. This will not be a surprise to most of you in the room. But there's the average hours per week. Again, I have it broken down by race and gender. Administrative committees, unpaid work within the institution, unpaid work outside of the institution. And where I have a star, they didn't have enough data to report a particular number. I want to just look at the black woman number there for a second and add that up. You're up to over 20 hours a week. That is in service, a kind of obligations. I think I have one more on this. This is at the top percentage, the 90th percentile, looking at the service. Again, breaking people up. And I think I know that woman at the top there. The 35 hours a week at the top in that context. Now, this is familiar for most of us. We know the issues. We know that when you are the representative at an institution, that when there's a committee and they want diversity on the committee, they will come to you and ask you to do it. One of the first pieces of advice that I give when I'm talking to administrators is to not ask. Stop asking. But there's also another piece of sort of thinking about what to tell the individual women about how to respond to these service requests. And to do that, I want to talk a little bit about why people, what the evidence shows about why people say yes. Because you could say no, but why do we say yes? And why do we say yes? Well, first of all, more invitations, which is why I say stop asking. The second is that there is a different perception of the benefit from service. And this is what goes back to my initial story about being on this committee. On the committee, one of the reasons why I said yes to being on that reaccreditation committee was that I knew that that committee was going to have the dean of the college, the president of the board of trustees, the president of the college, it was going to have people with whom I was unlikely to have any contact outside of this committee service. So there was a way in which, ex post, I will tell you the truth, I didn't think of this before, but after, I thought, you know, that wasn't such a stupid thing to do after all. Because what it did was it moved me from being marginalized to being more in the center of the work that was going on at the college itself. And you'll hear that from individuals in surveys. People will say that they want to counteract marginalization. The other part is that for many women and faculty of color, they came into the professorate motivated by a profound sense of mission. And so the challenge is helping them balance and figure out how can they fulfill that mission, that I am going to change the world and make it a better place for people like me. How do they balance that against this need to protect themselves and to move further in the process? And here is where peer mentoring as well as senior mentoring can play an important role. Nobodies. How many of you have a nobody? Nobody has a nobody? Okay, let me tell you what a nobody does. You get an invitation to be on a committee or to do something. Before you say yes, you must call your nobody. And your nobody will tell you why you can't do it. And it's your job to argue with the nobody about why you should, if you want to. What this does is it really does contract how many times you say yes, even if because you don't want to deal with the nobody. But even the nobody can help to persuade you to say no in that process. So one of the roles a mentor can play, and this doesn't have to be a senior mentor at all. One of my nobodies was one of my undergraduate students who was really concerned that I wasn't going to get tenure because I was doing too much service. And so what she did was she played my nobody. She would answer the phone in my office. And when people would ask to do things, she would ask them why they were asking me. And sometimes I had to catch her because she was saying no without talking to me. But another important role is kind of assessing what are the things that are strategic service, what are the things in service that will actually help you accomplish the mission you have in mind or help you make the networking and feel less marginalized, and what are the things that are really, they just want you there as window dressing, and it's best for you to avoid. The other thing that I found in talking to people, and I found from myself, and I've used this in mentoring, is that sometimes we say yes, then it really has to do with our ego. We say yes because we think we're the best person to do it. If I'm not there, who knows what's going to happen? Right? And so one of the other kinds of little tricks that happens is that I ask my nobody, I ask myself, is there someone else who could do this just as well as me or better than me? And if I can come up with a name, I give that name, although sometimes I try not to throw my colleagues under the bus. But it's a way of teaching yourself to say no and to stop that kind of process to make this time more valuable. So I talked about the three-ring circus, and I want to go through that, and I want to talk a little bit about seeking rewards, and then some of the things we've learned from mentoring programs. The three-ring circus, what I've done here is to try to capture in a nutshell some of what the research tells us are challenges that women and faculty of color face in each one of these endeavors. Let me start with teaching. We all know time. I've got time written everywhere. On the teaching realm, the challenges that women face coming into the classroom, that faculty of color come into the classroom, frequently have to do with the perceptions of students about your credibility, your standing, your reputation. And there are so many stories I've heard like the one I'm about to tell. When I first started, my first teaching job was actually at Duke University. And I was teaching an economics class. And Duke has a pretty strong fraternity culture, if any of you know that. I had some guys from the same fraternity who were in my class, and they were troublesome. You know, they were the people who were constantly challenging everything I said. You know, they would just find glee if they could find that I had dropped a negative or written a less than instead of a greater. And they were disruptive in the class overall. And one day they went to a senior colleague of mine. And they said to the senior colleague, "We resent being taught by an obvious affirmative action hire." Yes, yeah. Now, you know, I have a PhD from Stanford. I went to Wellesley undergrad. You know, I'm thinking I'm pretty big stuff, right? But these guys go to this professor. Now, what they didn't know, they went to this professor because they perceived him as being sympathetic, because he kind of was publicly, you know, opposed to affirmative action and all these things. What they didn't know was that he had been my undergraduate professor. And he was part of the reason why I was hired. So they came in, and the first thing that he did turned out to be exactly the right thing to do, and it doesn't happen enough. I've seen it not happen too many times. He basically said to them, "You don't know what you're talking about." He didn't say, "Well, you know, she's a new teacher, maybe I'll have to give some coaching." He didn't equivocate. He basically said, "You don't know what you're talking about. I know her. She was my student. I know you. You've been my students. She was an A student. You're a C+ student." Which was kind of mean, because they weren't quite C+ students. But he sent them back. Then he came to see me. And he said, "I hear you're having trouble in that undergraduate, in that class." And I was so relieved, because I had no one to talk to, no one to go and ask advice about this situation in teaching that was emerging, which is what's wonderful about having a network like what you have here. And I had just been fretting. And so when he came in, it kind of gave me an opportunity to open up. I said, "Yes, you know, these guys, they've been giving me all this trouble." And he says, "Well, here's the trouble. You're being too clear." Too clear? It's an introductory economics class. He said, "Yes." He says, "They're getting the sense that they know as much as you do because you're explaining it too well. I want you to go into class. I want you to go into the class and fill the board with calculus." I said, "That's not a prerequisite. I don't care. Just find an excuse, fill the board with calculus." So I went into class, and one of those young men asked a question, and I said, "You know, it's interesting you asked that. You might be interested in the derivation." And I filled the board with calculus. And I never had trouble again from those two guys. Not everyone needs to fill the board with calculus, and it shouldn't necessarily be the responsibility of the woman faculty member to have to do that. But what I have propagated in various places is that it's important for the department to sort of do that for you before you arrive. One of the responsibilities the department has is to come in and make that reputation for you by talking you up with the students, by talking up all the credentials you have and how you're the most wonderful hire the school has ever had, to change that kind of welcoming influence. What the research tells us is that these problems are greatest in classes where people least expect to see a woman or a faculty of color, in the math and the science and the econ and so on. In other classes, what becomes true is that material that is controversial seems more controversial when it's being taught by a woman or a faculty of color. The service, I already talked about service. Research, we have the issue of time. We have the institution, the strength of networks. We know that there's discrimination in peer review processes. There's lots of evidence that shows if people know who the person is, that there's evidence of discrimination. But I want to talk a moment about the psychological factors, because one of the other things the research shows is an awful lot of people just never send their research out the door. So remember I said earlier that the time difference didn't seem to be there in terms of research, but there is a difference in research productivity. What we don't have sort of rigorous studies on is how much of that is because people have done research that's sitting on their shelf. I certainly was one of those people. I would, write papers, and they would be working papers, and they would sit, and I would keep rewriting them because they weren't perfect yet, and I would put them back on the shelf, and I'd keep rewriting them, and they weren't perfect yet, and then pretty soon they were stale, and I hadn't sent them out. And that evidence is there that that is a particular issue for people who are underrepresented in the professorate, this desire to be perfect overall. So the last thing is the notion about seeking rewards and making decisions. One of the, and this I think connects back to the research issue, one of the issues that many people confront is that we are less aggressive in seeking rewards for the work that we do. It is both an institutional responsibility, but also an individual responsibility. Here, I'll tell another story in my role as dean. When I have recruited faculty, I am amazed at how many times the young men will ask me for everything. And the young women will basically say, that's a great salary, thank you. I've even gotten into the position now of, I will have a person on the phone and I'll say, I'm going to take off my dean's hat now and I'm going to tell you something as a senior woman colleague. And I'll say, many people in your position would ask about research funds now, or would ask about a course release, or would ask about this, this, and this. And then I'd say, okay, I've got my dean's hat back on. Is there something you want to ask me? This is the kind of information that gets transferred informally through the conversations that people have with mentors. And so it's one of the areas where if you don't have people to talk to, you won't know that you can ask. So it's important that that kind of information get transferred through the mentoring process. When I left Barnard and went to Pomona College, I was in the middle of the tenure process at Barnard, which is a complicated process because you have to go through the process at Barnard and then you have to go through at Columbia. And Columbia was messing around. They were taking their time. It wasn't clear to me that I was going to get promoted. Well, I got a phone call from a colleague that I had served on a committee with, back to the kind of strategic service. It was a national committee on the advanced placement exam in economics. And he had called me every year for the prior 3 years. And each one of those calls he had said, we're looking for somebody. And he would describe the fields that they were looking for. And he would ask me if I had suggestions for people, because the fields were close to mine. And I would give him names, and he would say thank you. And then the next year he would call again. So this year he called, and he said the same thing, and I was really pretty frustrated with him. And I said, because I was frustrated with the world at that point, I said, what's wrong with you people? Every year I give you names, and every year you call me up and you haven't hired. It's something going on there at that school. I know that there must be something bad. What is it? And he said, every year I've been waiting for you to say you were interested. This happens quite a bit, I think, because again, this informal transmission of how do you tell when you're being offered an opportunity, a reward, how do you tell that? How do you assess that it really is indicated at you? And I told him it was his lucky day, because as I said, I was pretty angry at the world that day, and packed up and moved all the way out. At Pomona, we have really been working on faculty mentoring programs. And I wanted to say a little bit about that mentoring program and some things that I know that you're doing and what our experience has been and what I know the experience of other places has been. We started with the formal mentoring assignment, senior person matched with a junior colleague. That particular program was very successful for a few people and had no effect for the others. Indeed, in one assessment I did after the first year, people told me they didn't know they had mentors. They had sort of lost track of the fact that they had gotten an email saying so-and-so has been assigned as your mentor. They hadn't matched up at any of the events that we had for mentors. And what we heard back was that the superior way of finding mentors was through more organic processes. Opportunities to bring senior people together with assistant professors from different disciplines and fields. And where people could find on their own the various mentors, because one of the things we know from the mentoring literature is that most people need multiple mentors. You need somebody to tell you how to find a new job when it's time to find a new job. You need somebody to tell you how to bargain for salaries. You need somebody to tell you to take that paper off the shelf and to send it in. You need people who you need your nobody. You need people who play those different roles. We also learned that just as I had found with this program I ran for graduate students, that the peer mentoring networks were frequently as important as the kind of hierarchical networks. Within the economics profession, we've actually done some testing on this. The Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession has a mentoring program that's actually designed with teams. There are groups of assistant professors who are put together as a team, and they're supposed to kind of act as nobodies, act as coaches, act as encouraging forces to each other. They're paired with a senior woman who's sort of almost the super mentoring coach for the entire group. So when they have something that they need more senior advice, they can go to her, or they can go to any of the other senior women who've been identified in the discipline. And they've done some testing of this with randomized assignment, and it's worked out really well. There's actual evidence that this kind of mentoring structure works. And so it's the direction that we've been pushing mentoring at the college. The other part that we've also experimented with is the fact that mentors don't have to be where you are. There is a program that several of my faculty have had really great experience with called the National Center for Faculty Development and Mentoring. And this national center is they run sort of webinars and other kinds of workshops that individuals can sign up for that help to work with time management skills, to help work to coach, to help work you to egg on. And we've had really high remarks with that kind of mentoring arrangement overall. I know that it's getting near time for many of you to go to class. I will kind of wrap up a little bit of this. It's been partly personal history, partly drawing from some of the data that's out there. Happy to answer questions, and also happy to talk about the MacArthur program if anybody wants to know how we pick the geniuses. Thank you.
I just wanted, if you could say that name of that National Center for Faculty Development.
Yeah, it's a national, and in fact, there has been some interaction here. I think one of the people who runs it is going to be coming back.
Right,
Diversities. National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. That's the name of it. And it is, they have a website, and there you can, the individual fee is not extravagant. And you could do, I think, individual pieces of it, workshops and things that they offer. Yes?
Why do you think the team-based approach is so much better?
First of all, I think it's better because it relies less on an individual having the exact information that you need at a moment in time, which is already requiring a lot, and of that person being available at that moment in time. I think it also works because it goes back to what I earlier said about diversity and creativity. I think getting together very different perspectives from different people can often help you inform what you're going to do. Also, there's an issue of styles. And so one of the things I think sometimes is a problem for the mentor-mentee relationship when it's one-on-one is that the mentor found a strategy that worked for them given their personality and their strengths. I see this happen a lot when I try to get people coaching on teaching. The coach will come in and say, you shouldn't do it that way, you should do it the way that I did it. But that it doesn't connect with how that individual's best strengths are. So having a mix of people means that you're more likely to find the match for that particular issue that you're dealing that best works for you. I think that's why it works. And then I think mentors, mentoring has its personal rewards, and some institutions try to structure rewards, but ultimately it's taking time. It's part of that unpaid work that I showed earlier that people are doing in the academy. Whereas peers, there's kind of a quid pro quo. And so I think there's a little more of a commitment there.
I was just having a conversation yesterday regarding people doing advising, and you used advising as partly the unpaid work. And I'm a senior professor. I'm also very aware that people just might look at me and go, yeah, Linda, you nicely see the world in a Pollyanna way that the rest of us don't. I want to believe that it's possible to be rewarded for, I believe I have been rewarded for a lot of that unpaid work. Just if you can comment on that whole idea, is it unpaid work? Somebody has to do it, and we can claim value based on that unclaimed work, and we don't.
Yes, yes, right. And so, and there's, I think, two parts to the don't and then the institutional responsibility. I completely agree with you, and it goes back to what I said about understanding partly why I'm here. And for me, it's part of my energy comes from working with students, working with the student who's lost, helping them find their way. That's partly why I came into the system. And so there is value and there has been reward for me. What I see frequently happen is that either an institution, but I have chosen particular institutions, and I've partly chosen those institutions because they reward and that value that work. And so there's a first kind of level of decision making of picking the right match. But there's a second level, and that I find many people fall into is that they don't find ways to document that they've been doing this and to get that somehow as part of their portfolio. And so pushing the documentation part, I find this a lot with people who do a lot of community engagement work, that the issue of writing it up, keeping it as part of the portfolio that then you're going to submit as part of your dossier is an important part of the process. I've been in institutions where they try to collect it, but if you're not at an institution that tries to collect it, it's kind of responsibility falls on the individual to make that available. And then that's my institutional point. And I think that institutions, and I'm kind of Pollyannish too, I think institutions are moving this way to understanding the importance of the faculty-student interaction, the advising role, and to try and document that and to put that as something you reward and recognize in the tenure process. But it's slow. And so there is a recognition that the more time you spend doing that, probably does cut into that probability.
And just the reality that if we're all stuck in those little bubbles and that's all we are, there's a lot of work that doesn't get done at a university.
That's right. That's right. And the students get unhappy and they leave. I actually made a case that I actually found some economic analysis that showed that alumni give more if they build relationships with faculty, and made that argument at the institution that you want alumni to give money, you better support the faculty who are working with students.
In terms of negotiations, you said a little bit about that. What are some ways of negotiating, rewards, right, at the institution without having to leave the institution? I know men tend to do that quite well.
So, I mean, and you're right in the first statement that there is a kind of tendency in academia that we only reward when you get another offer. But I think one of the things is being a bit of assertive and getting data together. So I've had faculty who've come to me with data with comparable people in other institutions, which particularly for public institutions is usually public, what the salary and compensations are, and have said, here's what I know people in my position with similar profiles to me are getting paid at other places, and I think I should get more money. So I've had that. That's a very respectable way to come in and have that negotiating conversation. Sometimes it's not about money, it's about other kinds of things. And this is where playing the card of the work that I do for the college. So coming in and saying, I served on that reaccreditation committee during my research leave. And now I need some extra funds in order to finish this research project. That's a reasonable negotiating kind of argument. And I think being a little pushier, not even pushy, just doing it, just making those kinds of questions is something that not enough people do as part of that process. What you don't want to do is to make arguments about contributions that aren't real. And because that kind of can turn off the negotiating strategy. So I've also had faculty who've claimed that they put a lot of time into a particular committee when they never actually showed up. And it's going to be hard for them to negotiate in sports on that basis.
Does anyone have any other questions that you'd like to address to Dr. Conrad? No? Okay, Dr. Conrad. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.